Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. We have chatted in previous episodes about the under-discussed topic, I think, of the types of biases that we see in artificial intelligence. We talk a lot about safety, guardrails, what happens when those fail, and increasingly the cybersecurity aspects of AI like adversarial prompting. What gets a lot less attention is the kind of mainstream everyday use of AI when it works, but we encounter tools that might be profoundly biased towards a certain worldview or ideology or political philosophy. We talked about this in two specific episodes. One was touching upon the concept of training data as being a mechanism for bias transfer. If models are predictive or extrapolating from their training data, and the training data is derived from an overrepresented demographic, like we talked about Reddit and very fertile sources like this being really associated with valley culture and a US centricity, then that worldview can be transplanted downstream onto the models. The second potential point at which the models can be really steered towards a certain direction is in post-training. I talked about the human reinforcement learning, a more deliberate way of doing it, which looks at a certain desired profile, see how the model does, and then tries to steer it towards conformity, so that by the time it leaves the factory, as it were, it's had two layers of, I think, really potential surfaces for changing the way it sees and understands the world. I'd love to talk today, Herman and Corn, about these two, not in isolation as we did before, but in one discussion. Between these two, which do you think is the more potent or potentially potent form of transferring a cultural bias onto a model? And when we talk about ways that we can mitigate this phenomenon, and I think it's not just about trying to have AI models that don't all sound overly cheery, like the common criticism about ChatGPT, for example, but it's about models within a linguistic group like English that might have users from totally different parts of the world, totally different walks of life. And if we want to have an AI system that is generally vanilla until the user layers on their system prompt, if we have deterministic models at this, before that even happens, they never really have a chance to reset themselves, as it were. So Herman and Corn, I'd love to chat today about bias, cultural bias in AI models from these two directions. Which do you think is the biggest determinant? And when we're talking about research into it, which of these two spaces has been more explored and by whom when we're looking into this big question, I think? Over to you two.
So, Herman, I was thinking this morning about how we often treat artificial intelligence like it is this objective digital oracle. You know, you ask it a question, and it gives you an answer, and there is this underlying assumption that the response is coming from a place of pure, unadulterated logic. But our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt today that really pulls back the curtain on that illusion. He's asking about the cultural fingerprints we leave on these models during their creation. It is February 17th, 2026, and we are still grappling with the fact that these machines are essentially mirrors of our own messy, biased selves.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, Daniel really hit on a nerve with this one. It is a topic we have touched on in bits and pieces over the last 600 some odd episodes, but looking at them together, training data versus post-training reinforcement is where the real magic or the real mess happens. It is like asking if a person is more shaped by the books they read in a library or by the specific teachers who graded their papers and told them which ideas were correct. Both are massive influences, but they function in very different ways. And in the context of 2026, where we are seeing models like GPT-5 and Claude 4 being integrated into everything from legal advice to medical diagnostics, the stakes for this cultural transfer have never been higher.
Exactly. And for those just joining us for episode 654 of My Weird Prompts, we are diving deep into the architecture of bias. We have talked about training data as the foundation and reinforcement learning as the steering wheel. But Daniel's question is about potency. Which one actually has more power to bake a specific worldview into an artificial intelligence? Is it the trillions of words it reads during its infancy, or the specific lessons it is taught by human trainers right before it is released to the public?
It is a fascinating debate in the research community right now. If you look at the sheer volume, training data wins by a landslide. We are talking about trillions of tokens of text. This is the Common Crawl, which is basically a massive scrape of the entire public internet. It includes Wikipedia, Reddit, news sites, digitized books, and scientific papers. If the internet has a bias, and let us be honest, it has many, the model is going to inhale all of it. If you spend your whole life reading only one type of literature, you are going to develop a very specific way of seeing the world. That is the base model. It is the id of the AI, containing everything from the most brilliant scientific breakthroughs to the darkest corners of internet forums.
Right, but then you have the post-training phase. This is what most people actually interact with when they use a chatbot. The base model is often quite raw, unpredictable, and even chaotic. It might complete a sentence in a way that is factually correct, but socially unacceptable. It is the reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, that turns it into a helpful, polite assistant. And that process involves humans, actual people, ranking responses. They say, this answer is better than that one because it is more polite, or this one is more aligned with our safety guidelines. So, Herman, in your view, which one is the more potent carrier of cultural bias?
I would argue that while training data is the source of the raw material, reinforcement learning from human feedback is the more potent form of intentional cultural transfer. Think of it this way, the training data is like the ocean. It is vast, it is messy, and it contains everything from beautiful coral reefs to plastic waste. But the reinforcement learning is the filter we put on the tap. It determines what actually comes out when you turn the handle. Researchers at Stanford and MIT have published several papers over the last 2 years showing that you can take a model trained on the same massive dataset and, through a relatively small amount of reinforcement learning, sometimes just a few thousand high-quality examples, give it a completely different political or cultural personality. You can make it lean progressive, conservative, or even libertarian, just by changing who is doing the ranking.
That is a great analogy. It reminds me of that study from 2024, where they took a base model and used different sets of human labelers to fine-tune it. When they used labelers who identified as more progressive, the model's outputs on social issues shifted significantly. When they used a different group, the model shifted the other way. Even though the knowledge in the model stayed the same, the voice changed. But doesn't the training data still set the boundaries of what is possible? If a concept isn't in the training data, the model can't talk about it, no matter how much reinforcement you do.
Absolutely. That is what we call the knowledge bottleneck. If the training data is 90% English and heavily weighted toward North American and Western European perspectives, which, despite efforts to diversify, it still largely is, the model is naturally going to be US-centric. It will know more about the Super Bowl than it does about the nuances of local governance in Southeast Asia or the oral traditions of West Africa. That is a systemic bias that is very hard to fix in post-training because you are trying to steer a ship that doesn't even have a map for those other regions. You can tell a model to be inclusive, but if it doesn't have the underlying data to understand the context of a specific culture, its inclusivity will feel performative or shallow.
So we have this two-layered problem. You have the systemic bias of the internet's dominant cultures in the data, and then you have the specific, often Silicon Valley-centered values of the people doing the reinforcement learning. Daniel asked how we can mitigate this, especially for users from diverse backgrounds. He wants to know if we can keep a model vanilla or neutral until the user applies their own prompt. Is that even technically possible, Herman? Or is neutral just another word for the developer's bias?
That is the million-dollar question. Truly neutral might be a myth because every language carries cultural baggage. Even the way we structure a sentence in English carries certain logical assumptions about time, agency, and hierarchy. However, there are some really interesting technical approaches being explored in 2026. One is called constitutional AI, which was pioneered by Anthropic but has since been adopted and expanded by others. Instead of just having humans rank things based on their own vibes, they give the model a written constitution, a set of explicit principles like be non-judgmental or avoid Western-centric assumptions. Then the model uses those principles to evaluate its own responses through a process called RLHF reinforcement learning from AI feedback.
I like the idea of a constitution because at least it is transparent. You can read the document and see what the values are. It is much better than a black box of anonymous gig workers ranking things. But it still raises the question of who writes the constitution. If I am a user in Jerusalem, my neutral might look very different from a user in Tokyo or Lagos. How do we make sure a model doesn't become a stochastic parrot for just one culture's version of morality?
One way is through something called pluralistic alignment. Instead of trying to find one single correct way for the model to behave, researchers are looking at ways to train models on multiple different value sets simultaneously. Imagine a model that has a toggle or can detect the cultural context of the user. If you are asking about a sensitive historical event, instead of giving one neutral answer that satisfies no one, it could say, from this cultural perspective, the event is viewed this way, while from this other perspective, it is viewed that way. It moves from being an arbiter of truth to being a map of different human perspectives. This is what the collective constitutional AA projects are trying to achieve, crowdsourcing the rules from thousands of people across the globe rather than just a few dozen engineers in California.
That feels much more honest. It reminds me of how we try to approach things on this show. We aren't trying to give the one final answer. We are trying to explore the space. But let's talk about the user's role. Daniel mentioned the user's prompt as the final layer. If we have a truly vanilla model, the system prompt, those instructions you give the AI before you start the conversation, becomes the primary driver. We are seeing more companies allow users to set custom instructions. Do you think that is the ultimate solution? Just let the user decide their own bias.
It is a powerful tool, but it has a limit. If the model has been oversteered during the reinforcement learning phase, it might suffer from what we call alignment tax. This is when the model becomes so focused on being polite or following its safety guidelines that it actually becomes less capable or refuses to answer perfectly valid questions. If the reinforcement learning is too heavy-handed, your custom prompt might not be enough to break through that preachy layer. We have all seen those moments where an AI gives you a lecture on why it can't answer a question instead of just answering it. That is the RLHF overriding the user's intent.
Oh, I've definitely been there. It feels like talking to a very HR-compliant robot that is terrified of saying anything remotely controversial. It is frustrating because it often shuts down genuine intellectual inquiry. If I'm trying to understand the arguments for a specific, perhaps unpopular philosophical position, I want the AI to lay them out clearly, not tell me why those arguments might be problematic before I've even heard them. It feels like the superego of the model is constantly shushing the ego.
Exactly. And that brings us to the research side of Daniel's question. Which of these areas has been more explored? Historically, training data bias has a much longer paper trail. We have been talking about garbage in, garbage out for decades in computer science. There is legendary work by people like Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell on the dangers of large language models and the biases inherent in massive datasets. Their 2021 paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots was a watershed moment. It forced the industry to look at how things like gender and racial bias were being baked into word embeddings at the most fundamental level.
Right, I remember that paper. It was a huge wake-up call. It showed how a model would associate doctor with man and nurse with woman simply because that was the statistical reality of the text it was trained on. It wasn't thinking. It was just reflecting the historical biases of our society.
Precisely. That research is well established, but the research into RLHF bias, the post-training stuff, is the new frontier. It is much more recent because the technology itself only became the industry standard around 2022 or 2023. Now, in 2026, we are seeing a flood of papers analyzing the political compass of different models. There was a significant study by researchers at the University of Washington that showed how different fine-tuning methods can push a model toward different ends of the political spectrum. They are finding that the human in human feedback is a very specific kind of human, often a gig worker in a developing country following a rubric written by a researcher in a high-income country. This creates a double-layered bias, the bias of the rubric writer and the bias of the person interpreting that rubric.
That is such a fascinating layer of complexity. We think of it as AI bias, but it is really a chain of human biases. From the person who wrote a random blog post in 2012, to the researcher who wrote the labeling guidelines in 2024, to the person in Kenya or the Philippines who is actually doing the labeling today. It is a global game of telephone, but with consequences for how we understand truth.
It really is. And the companies are starting to realize that they can't just have one global model that works for everyone. OpenAI published their model spec back in 2024, which was an attempt to be more transparent about how they want their models to behave. It was a massive document that outlined the rules for the model. But even that is a form of bias transfer. They are choosing what good looks like. In 2025, we saw the rise of sovereign AI, where different countries started building their own models trained on their own national datasets and aligned with their own cultural values. France has one, India has several, and we are seeing a real fragmentation of the AI landscape.
So, if we are looking at the future, what is the path forward for mitigation? If I'm a developer or even just a power user, how do I navigate this?
I think the first step is moving away from the idea of de-biasing. You can't actually remove bias from a language model because language itself is a system of biases and cultural shortcuts. Instead, we should be talking about bias awareness and multicultural alignment. We need tools that allow us to see the flavor of a model before we use it. Imagine if every AI model came with a nutrition label that told you, this model is 60% based on Western English data. Its reinforcement learning was done by this specific demographic, and its safety guidelines prioritize these 3 specific values.
That would be incredible. It puts the power back in the hands of the user. Instead of being told this is the objective truth, you are being told this is the perspective this model was built to reflect. It changes the relationship from one of blind trust to one of informed collaboration. I can choose the French-aligned model for a question about art history, and perhaps a Singaporean-aligned model for a question about urban planning.
And we are seeing some movements toward that. There are open source projects like the DALI dataset or Open Assistant where the training and reinforcement data are completely public. You can actually go in and see the specific conversations that were used to train the model. That level of transparency is the only real antidote to the invisible bias Daniel is talking about. If you can see the teacher's notes, you can understand why the student is answering the way it is.
I think there is also a role for what I'd call adversarial curiosity. As users, we should be testing the edges of these models. If you feel like a model is giving you a very one-sided answer, ask it to take the opposite perspective. Use your prompts to force it out of its Silicon Valley bubble. It is amazing how much a good prompt can bypass some of those post-training guardrails, if you are clever about it. You can say, argue for this position as if you were a 19th century philosopher from Kyoto, and suddenly the RLHF politeness layer might peel back to reveal something more interesting.
True, but that shouldn't be the user's job by default. The burden should be on the creators to provide a more representative foundation. One of the most interesting areas of research right now is data curation. Instead of just scraping the whole internet, which is full of noise and toxic, content researchers are being much more selective. They are looking for high-quality, diverse data sources that represent a wider range of human experience. It is more expensive and it takes longer, but the resulting models are often much more robust and less prone to those stochastic parrot traps. We are moving from a big data era to a good data era.
It's like moving from a fast food diet of random internet comments to a balanced diet of carefully selected literature and diverse perspectives. It makes sense that the output would be healthier. But Herman, let's get back to Daniel's question about which area is more explored. If a student or a researcher wanted to make a mark in this field today, where is the most unmapped territory?
I would say the unmapped territory is in cross-cultural RLHF. Most of the reinforcement learning research has been done in English by English speakers for English-speaking markets. We have very little data on how reinforcement learning works across different languages and cultural norms. For example, the concept of politeness in Japanese is fundamentally different from politeness in American English. If you apply a US-centric reinforcement learning rubric to a Japanese language model, you are going to get something that feels off or even disrespectful to a native speaker. Mapping those cultural nuances in the reinforcement learning phase is a huge, wide-open field. We need cultural translators who are also AI researchers.
That is such a good point. We are essentially exporting a specific brand of digital etiquette to the rest of the world. It's a new kind of cultural imperialism, but happening through RLHF. If we want AI to be a truly global tool, it has to be able to code switch culturally, not just linguistically. It needs to understand that neutrality in one country might be complicity in another.
Exactly. And that brings us to the practical takeaways for our listeners. Because this stuff can feel very abstract, but it affects how we use these tools every day. First, realize that whenever you are using an AI, you are participating in a cultural exchange. You aren't just talking to a machine, you are talking to the collective shadow of the internet and a specific group of researchers' ideas of what is good.
That is a great way to put it. The collective shadow. And my takeaway would be to embrace the custom instructions or system prompts. Don't just take the default setting. If you want a model that is more analytical and less preachy, tell it that. If you want it to prioritize a specific cultural context, make that clear. You have more power than you think to shape the voice of the AI you are working with. You are the final fine tutor.
And for the developers listening, the lesson is transparency. If you are building or fine-tuning a model, document your choices. Tell us who your labelers were. Tell us what your constitution looks like. The more we know about the who and the how, the better we can understand the what. In 2026, transparency is the new performance metric. It doesn't matter how fast your model is if we don't know whose values it is promoting.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. From the massive, messy foundation of the Common Crawl to the polished, sometimes overly guarded results of RLHF. It is clear that while training data provides the scope, reinforcement learning provides the direction, and both are deeply human processes, for better or worse. We are essentially teaching these machines how to be us, but we haven't quite decided which us we want them to be.
It's a journey, Corn. We're still in the early days of understanding how these digital minds are shaped. But the more we talk about it, the less weird and the more human it becomes. Daniel, thanks for sending that one in. It really made us dig into the guts of the system today. It is a reminder that there is no such thing as a view from nowhere. Every AI has a home, a history, and a set of parents.
Definitely. And hey, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the world of AI and beyond, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show. We are aiming to hit 1,000 reviews by the end of the year, and we are getting close.
It really does help. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your perspectives. You can find all our past episodes and a way to get in touch with us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have the full RSS feed there too, so you never miss a prompt.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I'm Corn.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.
See ya.
So, Herman, I was thinking about the stochastic parrot thing again. If the model is just repeating patterns, does that mean it can never truly be creative in a way that transcends its bias? Or is creativity itself just a very sophisticated form of bias mixing?
That is a whole other episode, my brother. But short answer? I think creativity often comes from the friction between different biases. If you can get a model to reconcile two opposing worldviews, that is where the new ideas happen. It's the synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis.
Friction is a source of light. I like that. All right, let's go get some coffee. I think Daniel is already in the kitchen, probably writing his next prompt.
Lead the way. I need some caffeine to process all this pluralistic alignment talk.
Before we go, I just wanted to mention one more thing about the research. I saw a paper recently from the University of Oxford that was looking at moral uncertainty in AI. Instead of the model being sure about a biased answer, they're trying to train it to express doubt. Like, I'm 80% sure this is the consensus view, but there is a 20% alternative here.
Oh, that is brilliant. Quantification of uncertainty is the ultimate humility for an AI. If it can tell you it doesn't know for sure, it's already more neutral than most humans. We tend to be very confident in our biases. An AI that admits its own limitations is a huge step forward.
Exactly. It moves us away from the oracle model and toward a consultant model. Here is the data, here is the bias, make of it what you will. It respects the user's intelligence.
I love that. Maybe that's the future. Not a neutral AI, but an honest one. An AI that knows it has a perspective and isn't afraid to show its work.
An honest AI. Now that would be a weird prompt.
Let's save that for next time. I can already feel a deep dive coming on.
Deal. Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been My Weird Prompts. We're on Spotify and at myweirdprompts.com. See you next time.
Bye.
Herman, wait. Did we actually answer Daniel's question about which one is more explored? I feel like we pivoted to the future of research pretty quickly.
Good catch. Let's be precise for Daniel. Training data bias has definitely been more explored in terms of academic papers over the last decade. There are thousands of studies on datasets like ImageNet or the various text corpora. But if you look at the last 24 months, the heat is almost entirely on RLHF and alignment. That is where all the venture capital and the top-tier lab research is going right now. So it depends on how you define more explored, by volume over time. It's training data, by current intensity and industry focus. It's RLHF.
That makes sense. The old guard is the data, the new guard is the alignment. It's like the difference between studying the geology of a mountain and studying the people who are building a resort on top of it. The geology has been studied for 100 years, but everyone is currently talking about the resort.
Perfectly put. The geology is the data, the resort is the RLHF, and we all know which one gets more attention in the brochures.
True. All right, now we are actually going. I can smell the coffee from here.
For real this time. Bye.
Bye.
Wait, Corn, one more thing. Do you think the coffee machine has its own internal bias for dark roast?
No, Herman. Coffee, now.
Fine, fine. Coffee it is.
Thanks again for listening to My Weird Prompts. Check out myweirdprompts.com for more.
And leave that review. It really helps us keep the lights on.
Okay, now we're done. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You know, I was just thinking, if the training data is the collective shadow, then the RLHF is the superego. It's the part that tells the model how to behave in polite society, while the training data is the ID full of all those raw, unfiltered human impulses.
That is a very Freudian take on machine learning, Corn. I love it. The ID is the raw internet data, the superego is the RLHF, and the ego is the final response we see on the screen.
Exactly. And just like in people, the ego is often caught in a struggle between the two. Sometimes the id slips through, and sometimes the superego is too repressive.
We should write a paper on digital psychoanalysis. We could be the first practitioners in the field.
Let's just start with the coffee. One step at a time, Herman.
Right, coffee, the ultimate ego booster.
This has been My Weird Prompts. See you next time on Spotify and at myweirdprompts.com.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.